So the first thing you need to know is how to label a triangle. And the thing to remember is that this will always be your hypotenuse. And you only talk about hypotenuses when you have a right triangle. Now, they will tell you which angle is your reference angle. It'll either be this one or it'll be this one. Let's say it's this one. So let's say this is your reference angle. So if that's your reference angle, one of these is going to be opposite, one of these is going to be adjacent. So how do you know which one's which? Well, you take your reference angle, and the leg that's opposite your reference angle, that's why they call that opposite. And then adjacent, that means next to. So, yes, this hypotenuse is next to it, but we don't use adjacent or opposite. It's the leg that's adjacent to the reference angle, so that's adjacent. Now, we don't normally call them opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. We usually just abbreviate those as hypotenuse, H, O for opposite, and A for adjacent. Now this reference angle, we use theta to represent what angle we're looking for. So if theta is here, then this is opposite, that's adjacent, that's hypotenuse. But sometimes they want to know the other angle, and so they'll put theta here. It's now, this is now your opposite, and that will be adjacent, and that stays hypotenuse. So this symbol theta, it's used for angles in trigonometry. So we have these three trig functions: tangent, cosine, and sine. Let's say you have this angle. Tangent uses opposite and adjacent. So if you have opposite and adjacent and the angle, two of the three, you're going to use the tangent function. Sine uses opposite still, but also uses hypotenuse. So if you have 2 out of 3 of these pieces of information, maybe you know this angle, maybe you know the hypotenuse, but you want to find the opposite, then you would use the sine function. So if you have 2 out of 3 of these information, then you'll use the sine function. Cosine, use cosine when you have adjacent and you have hypotenuse. So maybe you know this angle, maybe you're trying to find adjacent, but you have the hypotenuse. So that's what you would use for cosine. Now this is abbreviated on your calculator as COS for cosine. For sine, that's abbreviated as SIN. That is not sin. That's supposed to be sine. And for tangent, this is abbreviated as TAN. The first 3. How do you know which one to use? Sine, the sine function, to find the sine of an angle, that is opposite divided by hypotenuse. You can find the sine of any angle by taking opposite divided by hypotenuse. How do you find the cosine? You take adjacent divided by hypotenuse. How do you find tangent? You take opposite divided by adjacent. Now you may be thinking, how the heck do you remember that? Most people like to think of this as SohCahToa. So if you were to spell that out, it would be SohCahToa. And so that's what I remember when I think about it. SohCahToa. I've also heard some old horse caught another horse taking oats away. If oats is boring, you could put a different word in there if you want. If you don't want to talk about horses. But it's SohCahToa. Does that make sense? Alright, so the first step to use these trig functions, and why do we want to know all this? This will tell us angle measures. So we can use trig ratios to find angle measures and to find lengths of the legs and the hypotenuse. And the first thing they want is the sine of A. Here's A. Okay? So what I always like to do is I like to label the triangle first. So they're talking about angle A. So angle A, this is my reference angle. That's where we're starting. That's our theta. So this is going to be hypotenuse. And then the side opposite it will be opposite. And then the one next to your reference angle is adjacent. So we have 5, 12, 13. They want to know what is the sine of A. Here's A. The sine of A, sine is opposite divided by hypotenuse. So it would be 12 divided by 13. Divided by 13. Because sine is opposite divided by hypotenuse. Opposite divided by hypotenuse. Cosine of A. Cosine of A. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Ca. So adjacent is 5. Hypotenuse is 13. So this is going to be 5 over 13. Divided by 13. And then tangent of A, that's going to be, tangent is O divided by A. So opposite divided by adjacent would be 12 over 5. Divided by 5. So the first step is setting up your ratio and your proportion, because then you can find that actual angle. And I'll show you how to find the angle. We can actually find if this is 30 degrees, 32 degrees by setting up the ratio. So what I want you to do is I want you to find the sine of C, cosine of C, and tan of C. But before you do that, we need to change the reference angle. The reference angle is going to be over here now for C. Opposite is now going to be over here. And adjacent is now going to be over here. So go ahead and fill in the ratios on this side and see what you get. And we could go ahead and also erase the arrow, because now opposite is right there. Go ahead and fill in the fractions on the side. You can hit pause if you're watching at home. This is what we got: 5 over 13. Cosine of C is 12 over 13. Tan of C is 5 over 12. Alright, so now we're going to actually use this stuff. We have a right triangle. We know this angle is 35. We know the hypotenuse is 20. And they want us to find x. Now we can't use Pythagorean theorem to find this, because we would have to know this side too. So this is how you find a side, a leg, if you don't know 2 other pieces of information. Because to use Pythagorean theorem, you have to know 2 out of 3 of the information. So they tell us this is 35. That's important. So we're going to label and see what we got. We know this is hypotenuse. Down here, this is my reference angle. That's the angle they told us. And so, that means that x is my opposite, which will make this adjacent. Now, in order to solve for this, adjacent, they don't tell us what adjacent is, and they're not asking for adjacent. So I'm just going to delete adjacent because we don't need that information. So I need to figure out which trig function uses O and H. So I go back up here, and I'm thinking which one uses O and H and nothing else. That'd be sine. So here's the ratio I'm going to use. The sine of that angle equals O divided by H. So I'm going to say the sine of 35 degrees is equal to O divided by H, which is 20. So that's my ratio. From here, we can use proportions to solve this. You can put this over 1. And then we could cross multiply. So that means that the 20 times sine of 35 is equal to 1 times x, or just x. 1x is x. So all I need to do is type this in my calculator. 20 times sine of 35. Let's see what that is. In order to find x, which is this leg, all I have to do is type 20 times sine of 35. So I'm going to go out to Desmos. And you could go to scientific calculator and just type 20 sine of 35. And notice this is on degrees. You guys aren't going to learn about this in this class to my knowledge, but you can switch between degrees and radians. Those are two different ways of measuring. But make sure it's on degrees. It is. And that's 11.47152873. So I would say x equals 11.47152873. And then depending on how they say to round, if they say the nearest number, you say 11. The nearest tenth, you'd say 11.5. The nearest 100, you'd say 11.47. The nearest 1,000, you'd say 11.472. So depending on how you're supposed to round, some people want you to leave it as 20 times sine of 35. Alright, here's another example. They tell us 72 degrees. They tell us a leg. They want us to find the hypotenuse. We cannot use Pythagorean theorem because I have to know this also to find the hypotenuse. So what I want you to do is take a second, pause the video, see if you can set up the ratio yourself and find how long this is. Now it should be bigger than 6 because it's the hypotenuse. So see if you can find the hypotenuse yourself. Alright, let's see what we have here. That's the hypotenuse. Here's my reference angle. This is going to be adjacent. That's going to be opposite. Now, I don't need opposite because they want me to find hypotenuse and they tell me adjacent. So I'm going to delete opposite. So I need to find the trig ratio that uses A and H. So I go up to the top. A and H is cosine, the cosine function. So I say the cosine of 72 is equal to A over H. 6 divided by X. now I have my proportion. You can put this over 1. Cross multiply. I get x times the cosine of 72 is equal to 1 times 6 but that would be x cosine 72. 1 times 6 is 6. We're trying to solve for x. That's x times cosine of 72. So we're going to divide by cosine of 72. So x is cosine of 72 divided by 6. And I'll put the division symbol here, the better one. So if I type in my calculator cosine of 72 divided by 6, that'll tell me how big the hypotenuse really is. So I'm going to go with cosine of 72 divided by 6. Must have typed it in wrong. What? Why isn't that working on there? Oh, I see what I did. Dang it. Because when you divide cosine of 72, it should be 6 divided by cosine of 72. See that? Oop, and I'm recording. Yeah, so I messed up. This should be 6 divided by cosine of 72. Because if you're solving for x, you divide both sides by cosine of 72, and you get 6 divided by cosine of 72. So now when I type it in, I knew that wasn't right. There was no way that was 0.05. So if I type in 6 divided by cosine of 72, that makes more sense. 19.416. And depending on how they tell me that to round, that could be 19.4. It could be 19.42, depending on. So those are 2 examples on how to find a side length if you're given an angle and another side length. But what happens when you want to find the angle? To find the angle, you're going to have to use the inverse function. And so they want us to find the measure of angle C. So this is our reference angle. This is where I'd put my theta. And so they want me to find the measure of angle C. They tell us 3 pieces of information. I only need 2 of them. You don't plug three pieces of information into the formula, only 2 of them. So let's just use the sine function. So this is opposite. This is hypotenuse. That's adjacent. And like I said, you do not need all 3. So let's just get rid of one. Let's get rid of adjacent. So which function uses O and H? That'd be sine. So the sine of angle C equals O, 5, divided by 13. Now, there is an inverse function, because you can't find the sine of C So what you're going to do is you're going to do the sine inverse. So to find C, you do the sine inverse of 5 over 13. So C is equal to the sine of inverse of 5 divided by 13. And I need to put the inverse symbol up there. And it looks like -1. That would be the sine inverse. So if I type in sine inverse of 5 over 13, that'll tell me how big this angle is. Sine inverse So to find sine inverse, I'll go to function. There's sine inverse of 5 divided by 13. And that is 22.619. So I know that C, this angle, is 22.619. I'll round that to 22.7 degrees. Okay. Now let's say you had chosen, instead of O and H, what if you had chosen O and A? Would you get the same answer? And the answer is yes. Because now that's a tangent function. So you'd say the tan of C is equal to O divided by A, 5 divided by 12. And so now, to find C, you do the tan inverse of 5 divided by 12. And I'll put the inverse symbol here. And then my division. So if I type tan inverse of 5 divided by 12, I will also get 22.7. 22.7, same thing. So it would not matter which trig ratio you use. So am I finding an angle or a side? So that's how you decide if you use an inverse trig or if you use a regular trig function. That's how you decide if you use sine, cosine, or tangent, and then you use algebra or inverse functions to solve. We have one more. They want me to find angle M. This is my reference angle. They tell me 3 pieces of information. I'm going to use the sine function, O and H. So I know the sine of M, and that's what they want me to find. The sine of M is equal to O divided by H, 2 divided by 4. I then take the inverse of both sides to find M, and angle M is the sine inverse of 2 divided by 4. If I type sine inverse of 2 divided by 4 in my calculator, I get 30. That's 30 degrees. So I would say M is 30. This one, find the missing angle. They only told me 2 pieces of information. This is my reference angle. This is going to be opposite, but they don't tell me that. They don't want to know it, so who cares? This is hypotenuse. That'd be adjacent. Which one uses A and H? That'd be cosine. Cosine is adjacent divided by hypotenuse. So the cosine of that angle, we'll just call it angle A, or I usually like to use theta, but the cosine of that angle, I'll just call it angle, is equal to adjacent divided by hypotenuse, 4 divided by 5. So then the angle would equal the cosine inverse of 4 divided by 5. So anytime you're trying to find an angle, you use the inverse function. If you're trying to find the length of a side, you use the regular function. So if I type in cosine inverse of 4 divided by 5, I get that this is 36.87. I'd say 36.9 degrees. So this is 36.9 degrees.